Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Drawing Down the Stars. I'm Snappy, and I'm joined by my co-host, Graham, for Searching for Dragons. How's it going, Graham?
Great, thanks. How are
Oh, man,
you?
I'm great. I'm having such a good day. We're in a double Leo right now, Sun and Moon. I know you're not big into the astrology, but it's got me fired up, and I'm feeling it. And it's a new moon, which is always like the most magical time for me.
Yeah,
I got some stuff planned for tonight and tomorrow night, so it's just wild. I'm excited, and I'm also super excited for this because Artaud, right, is by far one of our favorite people. Just an incredible philosopher, magician, and like a playwright, I guess we could say.
more of a theater practitioner would be a good way to
Theater
put it.
practitioner, right? Like, what do we classify Artaud as? Artist extraordinaire. But when we think of Artaud, we do think of his work within the theater, or we think of his philosophy about the theater predominantly. And many people don't recognize that he was also an accomplished fine artist, right?
Exactly. So he dabbled with drawing earlier in his life, and then really emerged with the drawing later in life. But even throughout all of his texts almost, especially early on, he brings up drawing and painting in relation to theater. In terms of, we'll get more into that, but art has always been an aspect of his writing, even if we don't realize it on the surface. And what's interesting is that he didn't really consider these drawings. He considered them like magical objects.
This is something that we should talk about a bit.
We'll
because,
we'll get into the nitty-gritties later, but
for sure, that's such an interesting thing, right? Like, because within the Greco-Roman tradition, this idea of the eidolon, the idol, or the image, the imago, right? This is such magical stuff. It's beautiful. But before we get deep into this particular book, we should talk a little bit about Artaud and set our audience up. So, Graham, you're the biggest Artaud stan in the universe. Talk to us. Who's Artaud? Why is he important?
So Antonin Artaud, was born in 1856, and died in 1948. And he, in that period of his, from the 1920s until the rest of his life, he was deeply involved in art. He was well versed. He was one of the first surrealists. He was part of the first surrealist group, and then broke away to form his own theater of cruelty, which has shattered the conventions of theater at the time, and wanted to return theater to its magical spectacle origins.
Right. He was deeply influenced by the Greco-Roman theater, and as well as other traditional forms of theater that he read about and practiced. And he really wanted to break away from modern ideas like the fourth wall and return to pre-modern ideas like bringing in the community and the chorus, seeing the theater as an extension of the body, right?
Yes. He was also very influenced by the Balinese theater. He saw Balinese theater dance production in 1932, I believe, or 1931. And this deeply, profoundly changed his perspective and solidified the magical element that he wanted to incorporate into his work. And the metaphysics, so to speak, of the mise en scène, which is like the light, how the lighting, the set, the sound, the actors, the costumes, how it all comes together on stage as a mise en scène. And he wanted to give that its proper place above the text, which was still important, but he felt that theater had become a slave to the text, and wanted to break away from that and return to the spontaneous, magical spectacle of theater.
Yeah, the spectacle, the experience, right? In the traditional sense, like in the earliest Greco-Roman forms of theater, in the classical Western tradition, theater is a fertility rite and a transformation rite, a form of public purgation in which the public and the actors are all participating in a magical ritual worship of the god Dionysus in order to make the crops grow and to overcome trauma through comedy and tragedy and satire.
Exactly. Well put.
Just beautiful, beautiful stuff. And Artaud is really building upon that. He's not limited to that by any means, as you said.
No, but that's sort of we can see these elements as jumping points for what he wants to cohere into his theater of cruelty.
Exactly. And what really interested us specifically for this podcast is Artaud as the magician. What we recognize with Artaud is the theater becomes a projection of his life, and he becomes a character in his own life, and he undergoes a series of magical transformations, first beginning with his exploration of Heliogabalus, then when he goes to Mexico and experiences his first initiation, and then his mental health crisis and his initiation unto death in the insane asylums of France. I mean, the bad terms, but at that time they really were kind of asylums, you know?
They were asylums. That would be the right term for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And just, so he went through this series of initiations, you know, and came out of it this very magical artist character who was really about invoking the spirit of transformation. And he saw himself as a Christ-like figure, right?
He did. He claimed that Christ was not the one who died on the cross, and that it was Artaud who was crucified in the asylums in an attempt for God to enter his body and take place in the world, essentially. That's a whole other side thing that we can spend another episode on, but
the point is that Artaud is this deep magical thinker, philosopher.
Everything he does is about the myth in his life, the myth in ancient cultures, and recognizing that life itself is a mythical, magical thing. Life is the spectacle.
Exactly. And he truly lived his life as spectacle. And you probably know the quote, but I'm trying to remember. There's a quote where he talks about magic, and it's something about few people can walk the magic path. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, I know what you mean, but I couldn't paraphrase it. It's been a while.
It's this idea. He's like, many people can see the magical path, but few people are willing to walk it and allow their life to be transformed by it.
Mm-hmm. He says, but no matter how loudly we clamor for magic in our lives, we're truly afraid of living in existence entirely under its sign and rule.
There you go. Exactly.
I knew it would come to me in a second.
Such a beautiful line and such a truism, you know. Artaud, though, was someone who really allowed his life to be transformed by magic for good and for ill. A truly wild character. So talk to us about this book. What is when did this book come out? How did it come about? And what are these collections of drawings? Is it like from a specific period in Artaud's life, or is this a collection over his lifetime? How does this work?
Right. So the project was conceived by his dear friend and close collaborator, Paul Lefebvre. She is credited as the one who compiled all of his writings into the Œuvre complète for Gallimard, which is over 26 volumes, I believe, of his writing and his notes. And all the translations we have are from these documents that she compiled into these volumes. And so she's a very trusted collaborator with Artaud. He explained a lot of his theories to her, and she even worked on the two of Done with the Judgment of God radio broadcast with him. And she came up with the idea, I believe, in 1986 to put this together. And Jacques Derrida, the philosopher, also contributed an essay to the collection. And originally, these two texts, the text by Paul Lefebvre explaining his theory and the text by Derrida, were published in 1998 by the MIT Press in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this edition is the beautiful, large hardcover volume released in 2019, which contains the drawings that are talked about in the text, as well as many others. And most of the drawings, there's a few from the 1920s, but most of his early drawings and paintings are in private collections. And, you know, they had a lot of the drawings we see here were from private collections as well. And we got, Paul Thevenet got permission for her friend to photograph them. And most of these drawings are from the period of 1943 to 1947, one from 1948.
Amazing. Wow. What a crazy collection. So yeah, let's pull up our slides here and we can
Sure.
to this.
So here we have the cover. This is a portrait he did of his friend Colette Thomas, who was a younger actor, and she performed many of his poems after the asylums at private events and smaller performances. So we'll keep going. We'll keep going
Such a
here.
visceral portrait. I just wanted to point out, like, just
Oh, I know. It's powerful. He saw the human face as something that was not yet fully realized in reality and had to be manipulated on the page to reveal the true human face.
Beautiful.
So part one is called The Search for a Lost World. So he says that he used to, he learned to draw and paint during his stay in Dr. Dardel's establishment at Le Chenet, which is in Switzerland. So this was a mental health clinic, I guess you could say, that his parents sent him to in 1918 until the beginning of 1920.
Okay.
And here's a charcoal drawing of a self-portrait we have from this time, from 1919.
Wow.
And next we have another self-portrait from 1920. And these are both in charcoal.
Interesting. Beautiful. Really does
Yeah.
look like Artaud. I've seen some young photos of him, and you can see
It's a very striking image. So, two signed works among those that have reached us, Paula says, and which Artaud must have considered to be finished, date from the year he spent in Switzerland. The charcoal portrait of a young patient in the care of Dr. Dardel, and a rather beautiful still life in oils of 3 apples in a dish with Cézanne's shades of blue. Cézanne was an impressionist painter. Antonin Artaud had given it to a girl his age, Retta Elmet, who had come to Le Chenet in July and August 1919 to be with her father, who was also a patient in the clinic. They became friends. It lasted several years, and she kept this oil painting that he gave her all of her life, as well as a few drawings and gouaches that he created. We don't have these, unfortunately, in the book. These are in a private collection somewhere.
Okay.
But these works, though, all small in size, show sensitivity, taste, and a certain feeling for color. They also show that Artaud had always known how to take the most contemporary painting into consideration, from the Impressionists to the Fauves, that he must have been very familiar with the symbolists, and that he had been deeply moved by the anxious landscapes of Edvard Munch.
Okay.
So we know from the beginning that he was very interested in avant-garde and contemporary works, contemporary painting, from the very beginning. So in 1920, he arrives in Paris after a brief stay in Marseille, and he's entrusted to Dr. Edouard Toulouse, who was in charge of the asylum at Villejuif. And Villejuif was near Paris. And Dr. Toulouse was studying the mechanisms of genius, and for this reason, he saw Artaud as a choice recruit. And because of this, he was housed in the doctor's home with his wife, and he wasn't kept in an actual hospital, which was not a typical thing of the time. So, you know, this doctor deeply trusted him and wanted to nurture his artistic growth. And they still had their family still has some of the drawings he created in this time, which were shown in a London exhibit, one of the first exhibits of his drawings. So here we have a drawing of an écolière, a student, I guess.
Interesting.
And you can this is a very early drawing. It's from 1920. He hasn't quite come into his own in terms of his magical, profound realization, but we can see that his images are quite striking and exhibit a certain visceralness. They feel very human.
Very, very human. I love it.
So his interest in paintings, drawings, and engravings is also obvious in his first years in Paris, the years of his beginnings in the theater. So he became the co-editor of the journal Demain, as well as the theater newsletter L'Oeuvre, and these were both, and in which he publishes several reviews of salons and articles on painting that reveal his taste and his conception of visual work. And in these articles, he says, "Why do you paint? You paint to say something and not to verify theories. And what you have to say can only be said with the forms surrounding us. When we say something, they are what we say." Which is quite interesting. So it's essentially saying that I don't really know how to properly extrapolate that, but
well, he's recognizing, right, that all of our conceptions are based upon our relation of the body to form. This is a big thing with Artaud that you see constantly, right? And that the true ideal of something can only be understood through its relation to the body, right, into the senses. So when we say something, they are what we say. He's like, by calling and giving something a name, you are defining it and you're making it real as well. It's also that magical act that he's getting at, Drawing is not about theories, but rather exploring reality through perception.
Right. And he'll point out later on that the point of drawing isn't really to express reality at all, because what is reality? Which is very awesome. It's about a subjective interpretation of reality.
Exactly.
So then Thévenet says, "But these forms through which the painter speaks to us have no meaning unless they have been thought before and correspond to what he just discovered and was trying to reveal to us. The work is not a goal to be attained, but a means. So what counts more than anything else is the expression it transmits, either that of a certain maturity of an art or the secret vital palpitation of the model. The subject matters little, as is the object. What matters is the expression. Not the expression of the object itself, but of a certain ideal of the artist, of a certain sum of humanity expressed in colors and lines."
I wonder if he was familiar with that Russian supremacist art movement, where it was all about the supremacy of pure feeling, and then they got really into that abstract.
I wouldn't be surprised. He is familiar with a lot of Russian theater and paintings, so
you definitely see similar ideas,
absolutely. Very similar parallels. He then says, "Any inelegance or clumsiness are of no account if the deep discourse of the artist has come through the canvas or the paper in some way. The work is a movement whose origin is one intense absolute moment, the encounter between whatever of the model, even if it is a concept or an abstraction, passes into the eye and the head of the artist, and this impulse to express it, which will move his hand. And this movement continues long past the moment when the hand that transmitted it has ceased to move. It makes the canvas of the paper tremble, vibrate before this eye of the other watching, and years or even centuries afterwards can continue to play on the nervous impulse that produced the gesture." Of all of this, Antonin Artaud was already persuaded in 1920 and 1921.
Beautiful. So even at that early age, he had formulated this deep appreciation of art and its magical power. Wow.
Exactly. So he says, "Perhaps the voice, more than the gesture or the gaze, acts as if hypnotically upon the nervous temperament, producing almost magical effects. And the diction of the artist, of the painter, that is to say, his way of expressing himself, must be just as active and persuasive, according to Artaud, for he is an interpreter. The artist is the one through whom passes this profound truth, this truth that a formidable effort allows him to glimpse, and his work acts primarily as a relay between different interpenetrating sensibilities. That is why the intensity of the expression is primordial. It is perfectly clear when all is said and done that a painting takes its value from its expression. By its expression, I don't mean a certain way of laughing or weeping, but the profound truth of art. So he's saying the artist is a medium, a conduit between the idea, the muse, and the physical
Reality.
world, reality.
Right. That's so beautiful. Yeah, you're acting as that mirror in a sense. Well, you can only ever truly express yourself. All art is a form of self-expression fundamentally. Even if you are trying to recreate that which you perceive, it is only a recreation of a perception. It's a reflection upon a memory, always, right?
Always. Well said.
Beautiful.
So the importance that Artaud gives to expression in painting is comparable to what he gives to representation in the theater of cruelty. And what he will write there about scenic language can apply to painting. One only has to replace the word show with picture. So to quote, this is to say that poetry will inhabit exterior objects, and that from their assembly and their choice, it draws strange consonances and images. Everything in the show or picture aiming at expression by physical means involving the mind as well as the senses. So it should involve the body and the mind, this performance, this painting, this drawing, this art.
Beautiful.
This,
Or did I jump ahead, sorry?
yes. So this very necessity of expression leads the artist to be only slightly preoccupied with trying to reproduce apparent reality. And after all, what is this reality anyway? And does it even exist? For it is not by the faithful reconstitution of forms that he can bring forth from the canvas or the paper this vision that imposed itself on him, that his genius alone permitted him to grasp, and that he can pass on to us only at the price of necessary deformations. He says, why does the painter deform? Because the model in itself is nothing, but the result is everything the model implies about humanity. Everything that through the model can be said of life, life that is stormy and frightened, anguished, or becalmed. So these deformations are the artist's subjective perception of reality and their attempt to express that. Everything we express is a slight deformation of the idea in our heads, right? You can't fully recreate the image of a thought.
No, you can't. You're limited, right? One of the key things that all artists will recognize is that we're limited, right? Even if your imagination is unlimited and you can conceptualize something perfect, you could never create perfection. This is one of the curses of the imagination, is that you can imagine something far greater than you could ever produce. And then there's also has to be a recognition with the artist too, is that the limitations of the body and of the form of the medium in which the art is produced becomes part of that message in and of itself, right? All art is an extension of the body, right? And all art is a manipulation of medium,
A perfect example of that, to plug myself for a second here, when I was working on my graphic novel, I broke my wrist severely and I had to have surgery. And I had to actually relearn how to draw. And it was a physically agonizing experience to create that graphic novel. And that comes forward in the crudeness, but the visceralness of, I would like to think, of the art that is presented.
Right.
The limitation, working with the limitations of the body.
Exactly. Or like working with the limitations of an instrument. If you're going to force yourself to play something like an upright bass, you now have to struggle to make that instrument sound good. You have to overcome its limitations, right? You're defined by those limitations, by your choice of instrument. What's interesting here, though, with Artaud too, is he's getting into this whole thing about, how it's the deformations are where you see the self,
Exactly.
And also about recognizing this idea that reality is denied to us, that you cannot know the real, but you can perceive yourself in these, this pursuit of truth is in the pursuit of self, that the true reality can't be fully experienced. It's only a memory or an image that's lost, right?
Well said. Well said. That's beautiful.
Amazing stuff. All right, let's continue here.
Sure. Go back one.
Sorry.
No worries. I guess I forgot to add a slide here. Sorry. I'll just read it.
Okay.
So she says, reading these lines, we can't help thinking that 25 years later, at the end of his life, Artaud will make of the human face the battlefield for a frenzied struggle between the forces of life and death. But in 1921 and 22, drawing is at most for him just a possibility. He's acquired a certain skill. His glance is rapid and his hand drew it. He has been accepted into the Atelier Company, which is a play company, a theater company. And Dolan, who knows how to use the talents of those who work with them, is putting his gift for drawing to some use. So this is important because Dolan was a very interesting theater practitioner, and he ran a theater company and a playhouse in the 1920s and 30s. And he informed a lot of Artaud's initial perceptions of what theater is, as well as allowing him the opportunity to draw the set and costume designs for many of the productions. And so for a few years, that's kind of all he's doing until May 1935, when he manages to stage Les Cenci, which is his first theater of cruelty production. Artaud will never cease to take account of painting, either painting in itself or taken as an ideal model, or painting in the form of visual representation summoned by the theater, which intrinsically cannot do without images. So the theater is kind of like life in a way, in which it's a series of stills that we're moving through. And each of these images, each of these stills should have just as much resonance and importance as the one that preceded it.
Makes me think of that famous Kubrick line, every frame a painting, right?
Perfect.
It's a medium,
Beautiful.
but similar.
Beautiful. And that reminds me, there's actually a film that was created about Van Gogh, and every single frame is a painting.
I saw references to that. I need
it's
to check
incredible. It's an incredible film. So one of the recognized objectives of the Théâtre Alfred Jarry, which is what the theater company he forms in the late 1920s, is to invigorate a certain number of images, but evident, palpable images, unsullied.
Oh, wow.
And here we have 3 self-portraits. The top one, December 26, 1923, almost like a clown or a fool,
Very much so.
And then bottom left, we have a self-caricature from November 1923, which feels very vampiric, almost like Nosferatu.
I was going to say, it looks like Count Orlok, does it not?
Yeah, very striking. And I believe that film would have been out already by that point. So, yeah, maybe could have been influenced by that.
Yeah, never know.
Yeah.
Or at least art of it.
And then the bottom right, we have another self-portrait from 1924 or 1926, somewhere in that 2-year period. And this is the one that I wanted to draw attention to. Because it's so striking and very much captures the intensity of Artaud.
It does.
In the next slide, Paul Thevenin says one self-portrait, which is that one, which must date from the years 1924 to 1926, was reproduced as the frontispiece to a story by Marcel Belleau, published in 1952. And this pencil drawing was given to Marcel Belleau by Max Jacob, who was a friend of Artaud, towards 1938, which was hastily done in the latter's room one day when Artaud had come to see him. Max Jacobs' correspondence tells us that they saw each other often in October 1924. And the expression of the face in this self-portrait is very close to the expression caught in one of the photographs Man Ray took of him in 1926. A fierce look, his lips closed tightly upon some unutterable torment, which we will see in the next slide. This famous Artaud photograph from 1926. This is on the cover of a few anthologies by him, collections of his.
Right.
And we can, again, the unutterable torment, that tight-lipped glare.
It's a striking photo, and he looks really good in the photo too. So that also helps.
He does. But we can see the similarity in that self-portrait that he did to this photograph, you know? The
Yeah.
bottom right.
Yeah.
Very intense.
Same kind of face for sure.
Beautiful. Yeah. So Artaud's graphic expression will grow increasingly rare. In he sends a sketch in 1927 to Germain Dulac about the set for The Seashell and the Clergyman, which is a film that he created. And then a bad drawing, quote unquote, was included in a letter September 23rd, 1932, to his friend André Roland de Renneville, with a drawing which is now lost. And in Derrida's essay later on, we'll talk more about this bad drawing, so to speak. So she says, I had in my hands about 35 years ago some notes taken in 1933 by Artaud from the Dictionnaire de la Bible by Vigoureux at the time when he was gathering the documentation he needed for Heliogabalus. He had added 3 pen drawings reproducing some illustrations from the work he consulted, but the manuscript and drawings must now be with the collector.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
I know. I would have loved to see the drawings that were inspired by Heliogabalus.
Right?
Would have been amazing.
That's still like my favorite Artaud text that we've gone over.
Oh, it's incredible. It's profound. So Artaud almost completely stopped drawing from around 1924, which is what all of this is to say, except for a few drawings here and there. At that time, he's frequenting the Rue Blomet, where André Masson had set up his studio with a few other artists. And this is important because André Masson was a painter and visual artist he was one of the first surrealists, and he introduced Artaud to the surrealist group.
Oh, cool.
And Artaud pretty much lived in his studio for quite some time.
Oh.
Yeah, pretty wild. So from then on, the suppleness and subtlety of writing opened for him a more appropriate domain in which he becomes particularly fecund. In less than 2 years, he writes the Umbilicus of Limbo, or umbilical limbo as it's sometimes translated, the Nerve Meter or Nerve Scales, and the prose pieces with the language at once precise and flamboyant, those iridescent poetic objects that will be assembled together as his book, Art and Death. He also has a book called Cup and Ball at this time as well. And painting remains a presence still in the texts of these years. At least 3 of them are written under the inspiration of André Masson's work. And doesn't his work, the personal automaton in Death and Art take as its point of departure a portrait that Jean de Bochel had just recently done of him, with which he associates the strength of a fixated dream, as hard as an insect's shell, and full of legs darting out in all directions of the sky. So all this is to say that even though he isn't physically creating visual art anymore, he can't stop writing about it. He's always going to art galleries and exhibitions and seeing all the contemporary art that there is and just digesting it rapidly. From the end of 1926, after these 2 years of intense life in which he marked surrealism with his stamp, with such an ardor and such a fury that André Breton himself was shaken by it and feared seeing the movement exhaust itself in a certain paroxysm, Artaud again turns to the theater, but this time as a coordinator and director, as the creation of the Alfred Jarry Theatre. And we won't talk too much about this theater, Alfred Jarry Theatre, except to say that these productions were the precursors to his theater of cruelty experiments.
Right. This is
We're talking about theater now because with Artaud, theater, art, life, it's all inseparable.
Yeah, it's all the same.
And this is important to view. This is an important setup to view the actual drawings, which we'll see in a little bit. So for him, the theater as it is practiced in the West is unnatural and moribund. He must restore this true reality that it has lost, letting it recover this unique, unprecedented, integral character that certain written or painted ideas have retained. Writing, painting, music, theater are so many diverse means of bringing forth what is buried and solemn in our own depths, bringing it to light, trying to render it perceptible. And the theater, able to utilize every other form of media, also demonstrates this essential particularity of not being able to do without the multiplied body of the audience and having to act upon it through the intermediary of the actor's body. So again, it's a magical expression through the body.
It's always through the body with Artaud, and it's a body interacting with bodies, right? The audience is part of the expression in theater, and it's the only medium that incorporates everything, including the audience. You know, music includes the audience, but it doesn't incorporate the visual stuff, right? Like I said, like music does. Some art will incorporate the audience in the way theater does, but it doesn't incorporate everything the way theater does.
It doesn't. All other art forms can coalesce into this thing that is the theater.
Yeah.
So aiming to be a magical operation, we're near the bottom here, the theater can only be a total spectacle. And for that, it must have that total freedom which exists in music, poetry, or painting, and from which it has been until now curiously estranged. Thus, from 1926, the date on which his attempt to establish an integral spectacle leads into a theoretical reflection on the theater, marked by manifestos, until May 1935, when he managed to produce the Senshi. So all that is to say that I think I got something out of order here, sorry. But he has a theoretical reflection on the theater, which is that this is a magical act and we have to restore it, essentially, is all that he was getting at. I cut off the last sentence there, sorry.
No, that's okay. But for sure, right? That's his kind of big thing, is this return and revitalization, right?
Exactly. He says, to succeed in making manifest everything that is obscure in the mind, buried, unrevealed, in a sort of real material projection, bringing forth for all to see a certain number of tableaux of undeniable and indestructible images that will speak directly to the mind.
Wow.
So it's about, he talks a lot about in the theater in its double, which is this, collection of manifestos on the theater of cruelty. He talks about hieroglyphs. The actors and the costumes and the set should be like moving hieroglyphs, clashing and interacting and merging and separating again. Powerful, like universal images, creating new myths, new universal hieroglyphs on stage.
Right. He's really trying to connect to this idea of the ideal, into the ideal of forms. And he wants his actors to embody idyllic forms, that then can form these magical tableaus and act as eidolons, right? As like when you in the classical Greek theater, if you had a god on the stage, they would come out through this skene, right? Transformed and in this regalia, usually donning a mask, right? Obscuring the face and the eyes. And this is all about that transformation and creating, levels of distortion between these things. And this is all what Artaud is about. He really wants to convey the symbolic meaning of the theater and connect theater back to its original language context and to its original worship context, right? Recognizing the theatrical forms as eidolons, as idols, right? As these symbolic ideals.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you for elucidating on that. If that's the right word. I don't know if that's the right
so
word.
It's complicated because right, you're talking about the merging of philosophy and religion and theater, right? And he's very all over the place in his description of it.
Always all over the place. So once again, everything he says in this regard could be said not of common illustration or banal imagery, but of all true painting. And it is not surprising that it is also present in what Artaud thinks, imagines, and conceives. To neglect this fact would be to deny the importance of color and what it symbolizes in Heliogabalus, or the Crowned Anarchist. It would be to forget that a visit in the Louvre in September 1931 acted as a trigger. Looking at Lucas van Leyden's Lot and his daughters, Artaud was suddenly struck by the profound resemblances that exist between the staging of the painter, such as it is presented in the canvas, and the gestural system of the Balinese dancers, who appeared at the Colonial Exposition later that year.
Oh, wow. So he's making all of these magical musings by connecting these profound pieces of art, seeing the gestures and the staging of the bodies, and recognizing that these are primordial stagings, right? If you study the human form and you study painting, you study theater, you'll recognize that there are certain postures and performances that and shapes that the body makes that are visceral, that will invoke this ideal form, that will inspire people always. And that's really what he's trying to highlight. He's noticing these forms and recognizing them in profound pieces of painting and theater. Beautiful.
It's very beautiful. So we're on the next slide now. The analogy seems so strong and self-evident to him that he will make it the theme of a lecture, initially titled Peinture, which will become Le Théâtre et la Métaphysique, or the Theater and Theater and Metaphysics. And it is the only one of the texts in the Theater and its Double that makes reference to the language of art.
Beautiful.
And here we have Lot and his daughters. This is the painting that he evokes in the Theater and its Double as the ideal staging of a theatrical staging in a painting.
Notice that there's the skene, the red tent. Oh my God, from which the people exit. That's amazing.
Yeah,
wow.
once
And
once you think about it once you see it as a theatrical performance, it
right?
it highlights different interesting aspects of the painting.
It totally does. That's incredible. And
So I
yeah,
just
you
wanted
have
to
these tableau forms. Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. I just wanted to include it because we're talking about it, and it would be good to give people an idea of what that image actually is.
Right. Love it.
It's beautiful. For the gestures of an actor are so many ephemeral arabesques drawn with his body, the actors together constructing a sort of moving and colorful graphism that is akin to a painting with a stage for its frame. Everything must converge in this new language the theater requires. This language composed of signs, gestures, and attitudes with an ideographic value, in which the face offers the director the same thing it offers the painter. Its innumerable expressions becoming so many eloquent signs, and where, just as if it were a question of conceiving a painting, I quote, the 10,001 expressions of the face considered as masks can be labeled and cataloged so that they can participate directly and symbolically in this concrete language of the stage.
Oh, wow. That's so amazing. He's recognizing that each gesture of the face could be its own mask, and that each of these masks must be incorporated into the stage. Right. And that's so beautiful because it's like he's saying here, you're by doing that, by taking the human face and turning it into the mask, you can fixate upon each expression, and each expression becomes a manifestation, becomes an ideal in and of itself. Right.
Exactly. And it's no coincidence that the ancient Greek word for mask is prosopon, which means face.
Yep. Right. And it's the seat, the face is the seat of the soul, right, in the Greek. And it's also that light that shines, right? It's the place where the muses shine forth. Helen is the one with the shiny starry face. Medea's gaze is what bewitches you. Circe's gaze is what bewitches you, that power of the sun, that Helios, right?
I've also seen references, I've also seen stuff about the Old Testament that Moses' face was veiled when he spoke to his followers, and only took off the veil when he spoke to God directly.
Yeah, there's that whole thing, Pythagoras behind the curtains. Within the Pythagorean mystery, there would be all this stuff going behind the curtains, and that's where you get all this that stuff that happens in later, where they're making fun of it. What's the mystery happens behind a sheet? It's veiled so that you can't. By obscuring and by hiding things, you can turn something into being more magical. This is also a theatrical performance. What you say is equally as important as what you don't say. What you show is equally as important as what you don't show, right? What's happening in the skene is the actor donning a new mask and changing their body shape. So then when they come out, they are now a deity, you know?
Additionally, any deaths that happened in a production in ancient Greek theater happened in the skene.
Yeah.
You did not see the death of the character on stage.
No, the stage was it was a temple space, right?
Death is sacred, and the skene is sacred, and death is a phase of transformation.
Right.
So
it always happens in the skene because that's where you go to be transformed and reborn, to don a new mask, to change costume.
Exactly.
So wow.
So at the bottom of the slide here, it is natural that Antonin Artaud, as he reflects on the theater, should constantly allude to painting, going so far as to wish that the images created upon a stage could strike us in the same way as the nightmares of Flemish painting.
Beautiful.
So, very often, I'm going to skip ahead to partway through here. Very often in those months of August and September 1937, his signature is accompanied by a triple sign. The symbol of the feminine sex, which is also that of the planet Venus, augmented with an oblique stroke at its summit, on top of two triangles pointing upward. An almost magical sign for him, as are the two weapons he has procured. A little Toledo sword that a sorcerer supposedly gave him in Havana, and a knotted cane that he claims to have gotten from a Savoyard sorcerer, thinking it to be the very cane of St. Patrick, the patron saint of the Irish, a cane in which he will harangue passers-by in Dublin in a language that he doesn't know very well. We're on to the next slide now.
I love this image, though, because this is Artaud becoming Artaud the magician. He's now wielding a magical Athame sword that was given into him by a priest in Cuba. He's walking around with the staff of Saint Patrick, and we got to recognize he put those metal caps, remember, on the end of it, so that he could strike the ground and it would make sparks.
Yeah. What's important to note is that this is 1937. He traveled to Mexico in 1936, and he experienced a profound transformation with a group of indigenous people, the Tarahumara.
His first initiation, yeah.
His initiation, and from then on, he is convinced that his name has to disappear. He signs his books from that period with 3 asterisks instead of his name, and his work, The Revelations of Being, is simply signed as the Revealed One.
So wild.
Right? Also from Dublin will come those first missives, magical and protective, or offensive and invictive, that he calls spells.
Right, those art pieces. We looked at them in a couple of our earlier videos we've done on Artaud. You showed a famous one where he was attacking his landlord while he was in one of the asylums. And he had written her name, drawn a caricature, and then burned it with cigarettes.
Yeah. We're going to get into the descriptions of the spells next, and I'm going to show a few of them as well.
Amazing. So we'll get to see what I'm talking about here.
Exactly. The function of writing is no longer to just transmit a message or a thought. It must act on its own and physically. Everything is studied. Everything is calculated so as to strike the eye, and through it the sensitivity of the person for whom the spell is destined. The arrangement of the lines on the page, the very careful calligraphy, the variations in size or height of the letters, the frequent use of capitals, the way the words are underlined. Lines are sometimes displaced and signs are added. At times, especially when the spell is an aggressive one, the paper is intentionally spotted in places, and in others burned and perforated with a lit cigarette.
Wow. I just love this because this is really expanding upon this idea of the sigil and using grammar and language as this symbolic form and as a way to manipulate the psyche, right? You'll see similar talk in other really profound artists, specifically people like Austin Osman Spar, who would develop his own magical symbolic alphabet that became the basis for later chaos magic. So this is really profound stuff, right? That kind of calligraphy, the drawing of signs, and using this to create spells of manipulation, powerful stuff.
Every aspect is contemplated with the utmost intent.
Right. That's the key to magic right there. Utmost intent and contemplation. Focus. Everything has meaning.
Everything. So we know the frightful outcome of the trip to Ireland, which is the internment at Le Havre on the last day of September 1937, an internment that was to last 9 years. Oof. And during this internment, in May 1939, at the asylum Ville-Evrard, Antonin Artaud again starts to produce his spells. And these ones are much more elaborately drawn and more colorful. Violet, red, and yellow ochre spread out in wide swaths on the paper that will be subsequently devoured here and there by the lit end of a cigarette or the tip of a match flame. He says, and the figures that I was making were spells, which I burned with a match after having so meticulously drawn them. Something was produced halfway between a drawing and an object, and which can function as a talisman, a gree-gree against any trap set, or on the contrary, as something of an evil curse. And all this contributed to its creation, the writing first of all, but a writing mistreated, perforated, consumed, both the drawing and the color, and even the medium itself, the sheet of paper against which Antonin Artaud's hand worked away.
So this really reminds me of the creation of cursed tablets that we see in the early Bronze Age, and in going up all the way up into the Christian era, where what you would see is people would create sigils on tin and write curses, and then would either destroy them in fires, bury them in fires, or they would throw them into the waters or into the trash, or they would bury them in the ground. But there was a way in which you had to destroy this. You would transform the act of destroying the curse turns it into something ephemeral that can then act within the world above. You see this in many different magical traditions. Like in the Indian, people will give offerings to Agni, the fire god, who is that voice, the messenger, who takes your prayers and brings them to the gods. Ganesha forms a similar function. And in the Greek, we see Hermes doing this. There's this act of burning and destroying something transforms it, right?
Yeah, I was also reading about some practitioners of Buddhism who would use these like things that can release like single grains of sand at a time, and they make these intricate sand murals and then wipe them away once they're finished.
Yeah, I saw so many of those when I was in India. You get different versions, yantras and different things.
Wow.
in the Indian and the Buddhist tradition, but it's the act of creation. And then when the creation is done of these symbolic images, and often these are images that are meant to be meditated upon so that they can form three diametrical forms, these yantras, right? They exist as a two-dimensional plane, but when you project that image in your mind's eye and you hold it, it becomes a three-dimensional object, right? And what they'll do is they'll spend weeks developing these meticulous forms, and then they just wipe them away when it's done. There's a really beautiful rite I got to participate when I lived in India. I was staying in the city of Pune, and the main god for Pune is the deity Ganapati, Ganesha. And for his festival, the Ganapati Chaturthi, one of the things you do is you go and you get a murti, one of these idols, these eidolons, that's been blessed, and you invite the deity into your home. And he stays with you for the entire festival, the week or 2 weeks or what have you. And you wake him up every day with prayers, you feed him, you put him to bed, you treat him as an honored guest. And then at the end of the ceremony, you take him, he's made of clay, right? So you take him back to the river, and by putting him into the water, he disintegrates and goes back into the mud.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So he stays with you for a short amount of time, and then he returns to the earth.
It's
Magic.
wonderful. I love it. Reminds you a lot of as well as Gas Boucher's work, where he creates
Exactly.
sculptures out of natural things, and he'll bury them or let nature reclaim them.
Right. And through that process of natural transformation, they become more magical and enthused, right?
Exactly. So that these spells have an emotional charge is undeniable. They responded to a necessity, to the imperious need to know that one still exists, that one is not completely dead, though death is felt as possible and even imminent.
Oh,
It is worth noting.
I just wanted to add, sorry, those things are called rangoli. I just remembered the
Oh,
word. So
okay.
mantra or a mandala are types of these things, but the act of drawing it in the sand is a rangoli. Sorry. Okay.
No, that's beautiful. Thank you. That's good to know. I'll have to look those up because that's fascinating.
So, okay, so this was wild, though, where you were talking about not completely dead, though death is felt as possible and even imminent.
Imminent.
Right?
Powerful.
Again, this makes me think of the rites of Dionysus, because the rites of the Dionysian festivals of fertility are all about confronting death and transforming it into life, overcoming communal trauma, going through these rites of purgation, engaging in comedy and satire as a way to overcome the absurdity and traumas of life, right?
Exactly. And they say it is worth noting that Artaud will subsequently declare himself to have died at Villevrar in August 1939, thus shortly after the casting of the spells. And there is no doubt that one of their goals is to protect him against disappearance, to affirm his combative will. So let's just a quick side there. He claims to have been poisoned while in Villevard intentionally, and that he died while there. But
Wow.
the but the magic of the spells sustained him.
And we know that he really believed this. He saw that electroshock therapy and that experiences as a
Yeah.
death and a rebirth.
Later in the 40s, he will actually die during an electroshock procedure.
Yeah.
And yeah. So he says the goal of all these figures drawn and colored was an exorcism of malediction, a bodily vituperation against the obligations of spatial form, of perspective, of measure, of balance, of dimension. And through this vindictive vituperation, a condemnation of the psychic world encrusted like a louse on the physical world that is incubuses or succubuses while claiming to have formed it.
Wow, so visceral. And this is about this idea, right? Overcoming the manipulation of other people's thoughts and ideas, and recognizing that thoughts and ideas have almost a life unto themselves, and trying to perceive reality as it is, right? This is a constant thing we see with Artaud, because he was always, this does play a bit into his mental illness, and he did justify it spiritually, but he believed that there were black magicians who were actively trying to suppress his thoughts and were trying to obscure reality from him through the manipulation of art and other ideals,
Yeah. So he believed that there was a cabal of black magicians, and they were performing sexual magic to suppress his thoughts and succubus his ideas from him to claim as their own. And they're trying to suppress him for speaking the truth about this, and the truth about the horrors of society, the horrors of the institution, the horrors of capitalism, the horrors of the world we live in.
Right. And you also see him, he was constantly rebelling against any ideas that tried to define and control him. When he's fighting with his friends who are in the surrealist movement, it really becomes ahead when the communist stuff comes in. And then he's just like, no, this is way too restrictive. And politics should be about transformation and rebirth, about this individual. he could never get into any kind of strict ideology, you know?
No, he kind of detested the idea of ideology, to be honest. He thinks that it's interesting to have a school of thought, but you should look at that school of thought and maybe extrapolate what resonates with you personally to help transform you and not to conform to that ideology in its entirety.
Right, and he saw that these
Very
ideological
syncretic.
forms were forcing conformity, and this is one of the things he's constantly fighting against. He saw these as this black magic, right?
Exactly. So next we
Wow.
have three spells. The top two are from 1937 when he was in Ireland. And the bottom left is from Villevrard, a spell from 1939. And these ones were not color, I don't believe. I believe these were black and white. And then next, we have a very beautiful spell. And I will explain this. It's on the next slide, but we'll leave this one up and I'll just read the description so that people can meditate on it, if that makes sense.
Of course.
So this was addressed to Dr. Léon Fuchs, and the spell was sent back to Villevard personally from him. And the paper is burned in several spots and on the three outer edges with a cigarette or a match. He said in the letter to this friend, "Keep this spell over your heart, and in case of danger, touch your heart with your index and middle fingers of your right hand, and the spell will light up." Dr. Leon Fuchs was kind enough to write us, and we thank him for this, that he had held on to the explanations that Artaud had given him when he sent him the spell. So I'm gonna describe here what Artaud himself says about this spell. The spell consists of 1. Above in the middle, a mass of signs that represent the layered symbols of divinity. 2. Laterally on each side, the symbols of space and time, as well as the angels of the apocalypse. 3. In the middle, going down from the symbol of divinity, crossing through the whole spell, a line of red pencil representing the divine light that comes down to enlighten me and seek me. 4. On the bottom in the middle, a half circle with 11 crosses. When one begins a cycle, Artaud told me, one begins as if in a series, 1, 2, 3, etc. And when one gets to 10, the cycle is finished. Perfection is reached, and if one wants to go further, one must, if they're to continue, destroy this perfection so as to start a new cycle. This is why it is the symbol of destruction with an eye to construction and transfiguration. So the 11th cross is the destruction and the start of the new cycle.
That is so beautiful, and Artaud is such a Dionysian, that destructive force. Wow, I love it.
And he's talking about the cycles, right?
Yeah.
And then finally, laterally above and below, and sometimes elsewhere, there were burn marks. When I asked him to explain them, Artaud replied, "When I thought of you, I took my cigarette. I closed my eyes and struck at random. And since then, you are out of reach of your enemies and initiates, since you evaporated into smoke."
That's so beautiful. What a deep person. I love it.
So this is a protective spell. A lot of the spells are of destruction, but not always. That's why I wanted to show this one, just to show the protective nature of many of these spells.
Love it.
So hop ahead one more. Yeah. The psychic wields over the physical. Like their offensive powers, their defensive powers are evident, suffused with the energy of their fabrication, the violence of their intentions, and their devastating effect. Plunged into the world of magic spells, we can scarcely escape these flames, which from all sides lick at the tranquil and comfortable space where we would like to remain. We can scarcely look at these objects without being contaminated by their vehemence, or then we don't understand anything. We can only see an extraordinary theatricality rising from these pages, palpitating under all the tortures undergone, underlaid by a protesting will, which even as it rebels against them, is based on forms, signs, colors, and through that very fact sees to it that these spells are real visual constructions.
Beautiful. Wow.
And then he seems to stop drawing. As we see on the next slide, a few fugitive reappearances of signs in his letters around 1941, and then he is transferred to Rodez at the beginning of 1943.
Do you think
And
it
it is
could be because of his extreme poverty? You know, because by the time he's in Rodez, he's living in that hut, right? And he's living,
It'll have been 5 years since he's been in asylums, I think, by the time he goes to Rodez, or 6 years. And yeah, he was during that time of being in these various asylums, he was beaten horribly. And this is the onset of the war. And there were rations given to asylums. And all he had to eat for like 2 years was cabbage soup.
oh my God.
And he nearly died of starvation, which is why he was transferred to Rodez, because it was supposedly more humane. But it was at Rodez that he was subjected to electroshock 51 times.
So intense. So insane. Wow.
Just wild. It is only at the beginning of 1945 that he will start really drawing again, undertaking those colorful compositions, which he generally does on very large size paper. And then next, we should take note that this very particular notion of written drawings, which links drawing and writing, making them inseparable, lest we should imagine one without the other. We should also note this letter providing formal proof of it, that the execution of the first large drawings in 1943 preceded the obstinate daily keeping of his notebooks, the first of which dates from February 1945, as if it had been necessary first to pass through this form of drawn writing, of ideographic writing, for his hand to get reaccustomed to this major function which had been his province well before his internment, transcribing a thought upon paper or any other medium. So between 1939 to 1943, he describes himself later on as a debilitated invalid, incapable of leaving his bed for any more than like an hour at a time.
Oh my God.
He is described by medical documents as suffering severe decomposition of identity as a result of psychosis. He called himself a Christian and started writing all this stuff about the Tarahumara's being Christians, which he later rebuked and was like, I can't believe I wrote that.
Wow.
And he called himself Antonin Artaud, taking his mother's Greek name, and would eat like dozens of communion a day. And so he was suffering a very severe disorganization of identity. And it isn't until around 1943, 1944 that he starts to coalesce again into Artaud, and he starts drawing again. Showing what cannot be shown, representing the unrepresentable, expressing the inexpressible. This is what Antonin Artaud saw the sorcerers of peyote accomplish in Mexico during their ritual, and what he will devote himself to at Rodez when he starts drawing again, then writing on a daily basis. And if the drawings are for him, as well as for every line of his later notebooks, the manifestation of a war undertaken against the evil forces dispersed in the world in order to prevent any lucid consciousness from speaking out, they're also a means for recovering profound reality.
Wow.
So he's reclaiming his reality. He's reclaiming himself by creating these drawings.
And it's through this war, this battle that he's constructed.
This mythological war, exactly. So for Artaud, drawings and poems have an identical function, not so different from the kind of cure he would like to see the theater bring about, letters and signs converging toward the same end. And so it is completely natural that drawing and writing should combine to constitute what he himself calls in the beginning of 1945, written drawings.
So
and we'll see the first one here.
Oh, wow.
Super interesting. So as we can see, there's a ridiculous number of images, but there's also text smattered all throughout, hidden in the image. And this is why he calls them written drawings, because without the text, the drawings would not be complete, and without the drawing, the text would not be complete. I'll describe this to you while we look at it. Among the drawings that have come down to us, this one, being and its fetuses, answer to this definition and must date from this period. Being and its fetuses is space split in two by a median body, which is probably being, with its head at the bottom, an armless torso and its shoulders resting on two adventitious feet, with inside its trunk its clearly female fetus set in the opposite direction, so that its feet are parallel to the adventitious feet. Two other figures, slightly smaller than the internal fetus, and which are perhaps fetus is already emerged from the being, seem to float around on either side of its feet that are pointing upward. And
Wow.
the rest of the paper is spattered with diverse forms, bones, suns, wheels, larvae, ectoplasm, and a sort of mass armed with a spear in the upper right. At the top and bottom, horizontally, and to the left and right, vertically, inscriptions frame the whole picture. Two other vertical inscriptions can be read, one along the left side of the mass, the other as if aborted, with some letters purposely omitted to the left of the central being. And in addition, there are elements of glossolalia mingled in everywhere with the forms. So the glossolalia is this magical language that he's created.
Right. I remember that. That's so interesting. Wow.
Just wild. We can skip ahead 4 slides to the next drawing, and I'll just describe this one as well. In the second of these drawings, this is called Never Real and Always True. And on the bottom, it also says, not from art, but from the failure of Sudan and Dahomey. And at the bottom. And once again, forms fill up all of the space. Apart from some geometric elements at the bottom left and more to the center, a sort of little body without arms or legs surrounded by bubbles, and reminiscent of those wooden Russian dolls that fit into each other. The forms are deliberately larval, undecided. So of this, he says, the drawings I want to tell you about are full of larval forms, in the very stumbling of the pencil stroke, and I wanted them to cluster together, so that with the colors, the shadows, and all the reinforcements, the whole would be valid and singular.
It's so interesting. You can really make out the kind of larval bacterial kind of ideas, but there's still human forms in here too.
Yeah, there are. It's wild. So the body, the bodily form is always disfigured. The body is always disfigured in his drawings. Because the body is deformed in essence, and he wants that plays into his later theory of the body without organs, which is the transformation of the physical body through the theater cruelty.
Yeah, so that you become that higher self, right? The body beyond the physical.
So she says, if I have dwelt at such length on the detail of these 2 drawings, it is because they seem to me characteristic of Artaud's procedure at the time. He has to take possession of the whole space, populating it with signs and words, garnishing it in every possible direction with diverse weapons, without allowing the slightest breach to appear through which malevolent forces could go to work. Not 1 square centimeter is unoccupied. Likewise, in February 1945, not 1 square centimeter of his notebooks will remain virgin. The writing in the hand will stubbornly blacken the white page. The drawings, like the notebooks, are veritable war machines, and one will note in those executed at Rodez the frequency of cannons mounted on wheels, cannons that spit forth fire or point toward the sky like so many erect penises.
Wild. Powerful symbol though, right? The staff, right? You know, all of this stuff. Wild. It is a weapon. That force, that club, right? Wild.
So the quality of the medium matters little to him. He says fine paper encourages you to make masterpieces. Coarse and repulsive paper encourages you to make useful and needed works that will no longer be able to pass as beautiful. Mediocre quality doesn't at all bother him. On the contrary, it obliges him to a harsher necessity, to a more acute vigilance, the paper being an adversary to conquer and traverse, going far beyond it, so as to inspire and bring to life the forms that the hand has precipitated upon it. An adversary to be soiled, crumpled, scraped to the very limit of perforation, to be spoiled and made to scream.
Wow.
So he's talking about the medium of the... Sorry, I cut you off there.
That's okay. Go ahead.
He's just talking about the medium itself, the paper, and how that in itself is a part of the creation.
Right? The medium is the message. It's true, though, right?
Exactly.
You're defined by what you choose to create with, by your tools, by what you work with, and painting is if you paint something, it's going to be perceived as a painting, and it is limited by that medium, and it's why something like photography and painting are such radically different art forms, even though they're both trying to perceive reality through a lens, well, because of the medium in which that they're representing. They even if you were to paint something exactly as it was, or take a picture exactly as it was, the painting and the picture are not the same. It can't be,
It's so true. That's an interesting distinction. Very interesting distinction.
All right.
So this virulent struggle of the idea to emerge, whatever bruises and wounds it must endure, is what these drawings should show us, and is what Artaud wants to have art accept, exceeding the limits of art, as he wants it to admit the apparent clumsiness of the drawn line. This drawing is a grave attempt to give life and existence to what until now had never been accepted in art. The botching of the subjectile, the piteous awkwardness of forms crumbling around an idea after having for so many eternities labored to join it. The pages soiled and spoiled, the paper crumpled, the figures drawn with the consciousness of a child. I wanted all this anguish and exhaustion of the consciousness of the seeker in the center and around his idea to take on some meaning for once, for them to be accepted and made part of the finished work. For in this work, there is an idea.
Wow. Trying to express an ideal again, right? There is an idea. And it's all about, I love this thing too, where he's trying to bring back this childness, right? He's trying to have this kind of freedom and playfulness in creation with the forms, right? Beautiful.
Just beautiful. The sheet has already, yes. Artaud deliberately refuses to render these drawings with any skill. This drawing, like all my other drawings, is not that of a man who doesn't know how to draw, but of a man who has abandoned the principle of drawing and who wants to draw at his age, my age, as if he had never learned anything on principle through law or art, but only through the experience of work. And I should say not instantaneous, but instant. I mean immediately deserved. Deserved in relation to all the forces that in time and space are opposed to the manual, and not only manual, but nervous and physical work of creation. That is, against the taking of mental possession of the spirit and its restoration in the being of reality. So he's saying, I'm purposely not drawing well. Like, he's not trying to be technically proficient. He's trying to express an idea, and ideas are often crude and blunt, and that is the purest form of that expression for Artaud.
Right. Again, it's this childishness. It's that pure feeling, right? Like he was talking about earlier. He's really trying to express his emotions in their most pure form. And to do that, he cannot pursue perfection, because that would be to deny the emotional weight.
Exactly.
Wow.
Of these drawings, themselves clumsily executed, so that the eye looking at them falls, which are intended to make us perceive some unfathomable reality, which don't try to please us, but rather to alert us. Artaud will say that they are documents or even sensations. And this is my favorite Artaud quote on drawing. This drawing is a sensation. that has passed into me, as they say in certain legends, that death passes, and which I wanted to grasp in its flight and draw absolutely naked.
Wow. Experience the emotion in its full rawness and absolute purity, and then express it in its full rawness and absolute purity as one goes through the death rites in that initiation unto death. And you know what they say in the mysteries? You have to die before you die so that you don't die when you die. Right? And this is, if you want to experience the truth of your emotions, you have to go through the process of expressing them. Wow. Beautiful.
Well said. So next we just have a really cool drawing. This is untitled, April 27th, 1947. So this would have been when he was at Ivory Saint Sin after Rodez.
I love
And
it. It's so surreal. It's so surreal.
Right? It's like, is this it looks, if you look closely, you can see a skeletal arm, a face, maybe a leg. It's like a body that's been reconfigured into a totem.
It's like you have these two gaping holes for the eyes. You kind of have a distorted face here of some kind of form, but then there's almost mechanical or wings, and like it's hard to tell what bones and oh wow, it's like all this different stuff mashed in together.
And this
then it's like
lasso,
it's coming out of that burn too, right? Is this a burn mark?
I don't think so. I think this is all just done with pencil.
Okay.
But he would draw so vigorously that it would perforate the page sometimes.
Wow.
And we have this noose or this lasso hanging down from the bottom, which is an image that will reappear in his last drawing that he creates, which we'll look at a little bit later.
Oh wow, so it's a lasso. Amazing.
Yeah. The face quickly stops being an object to reproduce and becomes, on the sheet where Artaud forms hatchings, stripes, wrinkles, scrunching his pencil down until it breaks off, the very theater of a war from which he will emerge devastated, panting, and shrieking, with a truth never until then attained. In the portraits I drew, I tried above all not to forget the nose, the mouth, the ears, or the hair, but I tried to make the face that was speaking to me tell the secret of an old human history, which passes by as if dead in the mind of Ingres or of Holbein.
This immediately just makes me think of Poe, because like if you read a story like Ligeia, when he's talking about that divine beauty, all he can remember about her is the face, right? Everything else, and her intelligence, nothing else matters. It's like they were husband and wife. He can't even remember her last name or where they met, but he can describe every detail of her face, you know?
The face is a powerful image, which he sees drawing the human face as a war against image and form.
Wow.
So this next part's really cool. I'm just going to read the next few slides in sequence. She's describing the editor and author of this section, Paula Thevenet. She's describing him creating one of her portraits. So she says, I remember Artaud very well as he was doing my portrait in November and December of 1946. He had set his sheet of paper on the dining table and stood before it with many pencils in reserve, as always, in his jacket pocket. He had me seated across from him, but didn't force me not to move. Every now and then he would get completely absorbed in what he was doing, sweeping his pencil over the paper, or suddenly stopping his movement, jabbing it hard into the paper, or again squeezing his thumb against the page to give more nuance to the intensity of the blackened parts, shadowing the forehead, the cheeks, or the chin. Looking up from time to time to stare at me with his vivid blue eyes, whose eyelids he wrinkled to better discern the detail he was trying to isolate and wanted to bring to the fore. But he could also hum or joke, though without letting his mind wander. I saw him return insistently to one specific spot on my face, tinker with it, passing his pencil over and over the same spot, making it gleam like mica, erasing it, starting over again. This went on for several days. The result was surprising, magnificent, but terrifying. Artaud looks at me, looked again at his drawing, then again at me, and finally declared, I have given you the face of an old empire of barbarian times. And it was true. I am sorry not to be able to see that portrait again today. I have the impression that Artaud had shown an extraordinary prescience in it, and that his drawing revealed in advance the face that life was going to give me.
Oh wow! So it was a prescient drawing.
Yeah.
We don't have this one, unfortunately.
No, this one is lost to time, probably in a collection.
Oh,
We have another portrait that he's done of her when we get into the drawing section, which will be in just a couple slides.
amazing.
So just as in the ritual of the Terra Chimeras, the liver and spleen of the participant produced an alphabet to decode unrevealed mysteries, so the face produced signs, inscribed in its very dermis, that allow the draftsman, if he knows how to act as a poet, which is to say, as a seer, to read a destiny therein. And that is what Artaud does when he draws a face. He strips it bare, makes the most secret things it contains stand out, unveils it what it will be. My portraits are those I wanted to represent, they themselves wanted to be. It's their destiny I wanted to represent without worrying about anything other than a certain barbarity, yes, a certain unschooled cruelty. But who could find it amidst the species?
Oh wow, that's so wild.
Yeah. We'll jump ahead a few slides here because there's a lot.
Okay.
Let's go next one. So in every line that Artaud writes, every gesture that he makes, the reference to the theater is constant, even if only implicit. The operation he undertakes when he hurls one of those limbless faces into life is a theatrical act, which produces the undeniable dramatic power of his portraits. And it is no mere chance if when Pierre Loeb wishes to close the exhibition drawings and portraits with a reading of texts, Artaud writes in order to read as a prologue, Le théâtre et la science, where he affirms that the theater is this crucible of fire and true meat, where anatomically, through the trampling of bones, limbs, and syllables, bodies are remade, and the mythical act of making a body is presented physically and naked.
Oh wow, I love that. That's amazing.
Right?
Really recognizing those mystery rites in that ancient theater.
It's beautiful. When it comes to Artaud, how can we separate into genres, set limits to categories? Theater, poetry, writing, drawing are so inextricably mixed together, and even more so in the last 2 years of his life, that it isn't really possible to talk about writing without evoking drawing, or of the latter without theater or poetry cropping up. Because as he says, poetry is multiplicity turned up and sending forth flames. They are so devouring, these flames. The words fail when speaking of his very last drawings, these forests of intermingled faces, sometimes haunted by his own. His accumulated heads erected as totems, these landscapes constellated with eyes, syllables, or words of he peoples with dead women, of whom he makes living ones, and living ones who must pass through death in order to live. How evoke, how make one feel the violence or the shimmer of the blacks and grays he obtains with just his pencil alone and the flat of his thumb.
Wow.
Dead women of who he makes living ones, and living ones who must pass through death in order to live. Is that not speaking of Artaud himself? Is that
Yeah,
not Artaud? He had to die in
absolutely.
asylums to come forward as Artaud the Momo, the fool transformed as a magician.
Absolutely. Right. His life became theater and he went through the mysteries. He was initiated multiple times and he was transformed by it. And as you said, he became the Momo. Wow.
Exactly. So this is a self-portrait with knife from his notebook page, from a note page of his notebook in Ivory, Paris, March 1947. So this is one of his written drawings in his notebooks. The text matched with the image, and it's pretty intense.
The sword is piercing his third eye.
Yeah.
Wow. It's so
just,
intense.
just powerful. One last slide before we get into the drawings. So these drawings themselves, these violent objects or acts hurled into space, what are they? What do they mean? The innate totem of man, the Grigris, to return to man. Magical objects like spells, they are breathed out, expelled with all the force of the breath to assassinate magic, to bring back the time when man was a tree without organs or functions, but made of will, and a tree of a will on the march. Pretty intense.
Amazing. A
Fashioned
tree.
for ex. Hmm?
Is it a tree will? Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, a tree without organs or functions, but made of will. Fashioned for exorcism and war, the pencil lead gives them the flash of metal. They shine like dark weapons. They flash like Greek fires to help better pierce the shadows, to triumph over the innumerable enemies of the true human body. Their reason for being is not aesthetic. It is profoundly that of a disbanding the troops of nothingness, those beasts without will or proper thought, that is, without proper pain, without the acceptance in them of the will of a proper pain, and who have found no other means of living than to falsify humanity.
Wow. Falsify humanity. So intense.
So now we come to the drawings. The first one is the totem from December 1945, pencil and colored chalk. So it's definitely a totem. We can see almost like legs, and one of them is severed, or maybe it's a phallus that's dripping blood
Oh wow.
on the left, and then
Yeah.
these weird appendage-like forms extending out from it. There are a lot of these drawings, except for the last one, she doesn't give full-on theories of what they're about. They just show the images and let us sort of extrapolate our own meaning from them.
Definitely getting tentacle vibes from these weird appendages. And yeah, I see
Right?
what you mean with that potentially severed leg. And it's
Either
weird.
a leg sticking out that's severed, or it's a phallus that's dripping blood. It's hard to say. I think it might be a severed leg.
I think that's my perception, but it's wild.
Next, we have the bouillabaisse of forms in the Tower of Babel, which is pencil and colored chalk from 1946. And a bouillabaisse is a fish stew that was popular in France. To go to what you were saying in your tarot reading about the magic of soup and cooking and pots and stuff, it's
Right?
like,
Mixing everything together, right? It's the cooking metaphors are all everywhere, right? And it's so interconnected. A lot of people forget, if you go back to the ancient cookery, what is a coffin? A coffin was a type of pie that you would bake your food in so it didn't burn, and when you had an open fire, and you put your food in the coffin so that it can be properly cooked. The satire plate, originally at the mysteries, you would cut up all the fruit and the sacrifice and mix it up on a satire on a plate, and then you would reveal it. And then this is part of the mystery when you're eating and you're mixing things and putting them together to create new forms, right? It's all about that chemistry of transformation. It's, again, when I just keep thinking about the Olympics, and everyone was freaking out over that Olympic ceremony when Dionysus comes out on a satire plate and they remove the shield and he's there. It's like, anyway,
it was profound, and it was profoundly magical.
Profoundly magical, which is why the Christians flipped the hell out.
Yep. And just, the fact that he puts this bouillabaisse of form into the Tower of Babel, or the Tower of Babel, right? It's like the mixing of languages and like the scrambling and the confusion.
Right.
So next we have, the Sexual Awkwardness of God from 1946, pencil and colored chalk. And it's a pretty wild image. I don't really know what to make of it. We can see some, like, in the middle, some ghostly legs or something, and like these weird geometric forms, but then like these amorphous blobs as well. It's like you really can't classify this in any specific genre of art, other than maybe avant-garde. And he himself didn't call these art,
No,
right? These are magical signs and symbols.
it's beautiful. I love it. And yeah,
Next we
it's so abstract.
Yeah. Next, we have one of my favorites, The Theater of Cruelty from 1946. Once again, pencil and colored chalk. And The Mummy is interesting. I want to read a quick short passage from Collected Works, Volume 1, from his book Cup and Ball, The Mummy Correspondence. And this is from like the 1920s when he's talking about mummies. He says, there is bodily loss in this mummy, and there is complete incapability to conjure up this body in the melancholy of speech of its intellectual flesh. This feeling running through the veins of this mystical body, in which each convulsion is a manner of world and another sort of birth, loses and consumes itself in the burning of mistaken oblivion.
That's amazing.
And to me, he talks about the mummy as being sort of like a confining form, but I think it's the ideal body without organs because it's literally a body without organs.
Right? And they're putting it through this transformation state to turn it into that body without organs so that you can survive.
They put it in the sarcophagus, the coffin to cook it, right?
Exactly. All of this is all done. It's you get all these parallels too, right? I always think one of the more interesting mummy type rituals that I'm familiar with comes from Phoenicia, and it comes from the king rites associated with the god Melkart, who's a version of Heracles. And in the Melkart rite, when they would every year when they had to redo these rituals to inter the king so that the king was legitimate upon the throne, and what they would do is they take him, shave him down with razors and make cuts on his body while they did this. Then they would cover him in this ointment, a magical ointment, then wrap him in the mummy wrap, okay? Except for his phallus, which would be erect because of the drugs, okay?
Of course.
And then they would intern him in this chamber, a death chamber, right? Where he would be fumigated in a bath of smoke while wrapped as the mummy. And then when everything lines up and that light of Venus could shine down into the temple complex, that's when the priestess would go in and she would mount him and ride the phallus. And the idea is when he orgasmed, he'd wake up and come back to life. And if he didn't, this would have to attack him and wake him up. And if he came back to life, he brought a divine child. He drew down the star and impregnated the priestess, and he went through the rites of death and rebirth.
Absolutely wild.
Right?
Wow.
So it makes me think of all this when I look at these mummy rites of transformation and of destroying and rebuilding the body,
Yeah, totally. That's incredible.
Amazing, eh?
Yeah. So next we have the Inca, which is made with colored chalk from 1946. And I read in a notes in a different book that this is actually a self-portrait.
Oh, wow. I can see it.
A reimagining of him as an Incan warrior, and he's holding two shields. And then there's two shields on his legs. And this brings to mind the Four of Discs to me.
Oh, yeah, totally. Building that foundation. And I think it's interesting. He has almost like webbed or bird-like feet. And he looks like he has two fish. That could be the symbol of Pisces. Wow.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I didn't even notice that before.
That's an interesting one.
It's such a beautiful image. The yellows, the orange, the blues, and the reds. They're all just like so striking.
The face is so striking. There's so much emotion in something so simple.
The eye is just gazing from like this world beyond,
Yeah, I love it.
So next we have The Blue Head from 1946. The title was provided by Artaud in the list he drew up for an exhibit he put on when he was alive. Artaud told us that this drawing depicted a face he saw in a dream. It is probably one of the last drawings done in Rodez.
This is terrifying.
It is haunting as fuck, if you don't mind me saying that.
Yeah, no. Whoa, what a distorted, distorted face. That
The
is
image of the dream, right? Haunting him.
wow, that's terrifying.
Just terrifying. This is a portrait. I can't remember of who. I forgot to take a note of that, but it's one of his friends.
Beautiful.
Just beautiful, and again, the way he smudges the lead and the dark lines, the shadows under their eyes reveal this profound melancholy almost, you know?
Absolutely.
So next is the portrait of Jacques Prevel, which we'll see on the next slide. And it's surrounded with, let's go to the portrait, and I'll translate the text around it. So the inscriptions, one of them says, if Jacques-Marie Prevel could know what sin overwhelms him, and I who do not believe in sin, I'd say what sin puts on him Jacques Prevel overwhelms. May Jacques-Marie Prevel not commit the sin on which his entire face meditates. May Marie within him premeditate against Jacques Prevel. And then the inscription along the right side says, the broken androgen resumed and tempted the man, but tempted the woman at the same time, and Satan the madman is everywhere.
Oh wow.
And
That's incredible.
this is his friend Jacques Prevel, who I have a book of his poetry that was finally brought into translation in the past couple of years. He was a close friend of Artaud in the last years of his life, and he kept a diary of all their interactions called In the Company of Antonin Artaud. And that's why I know about him. And then finally his poetry came into translation, and I was like, yes! And it's really damn good poetry. I highly recommend you seek it out.
You shared some with me. It's great. We should definitely talk about him at some point on the show.
We will.
Amazing.
So next, I don't remember who this is of either, but it is just profound. Like this aura that the face is emanating of blues and blacks, and then there's these intense layers of text that is overlapping.
It's so wild.
There's some eyes floating around in there as well.
Right.
It's pretty wild. Pretty wild.
Looks like it's decaying, does it not?
Like what?
The face looks almost like she's decaying.
Yeah. Decaying and then emitting this aura of like transformation.
Right.
It's wild. Next, we have a portrait of Paula Thevenet herself, the one who wrote the first section that we read. And we can see some strange totems and texts kind of floating around her. This isn't the one that she described him creating for her. This is a separate one.
Still incredible. Next,
we have a self-portrait.
Wow, he's a zombie. He's total decaying here. Jeez.
Yeah. This is from 1946. So this is what have probably been after the electroshock experiences, after his death and rebirth. Next, we have another self-portrait. Just this weird mingling of forms. We have the hand making this sign, right?
Yeah. Interesting.
And yeah, and just this weird mass of forms. I just love how you would literally just scratch until the pencils broke or the page would rip, you know? It was just such fury and intensity in these images. As we see in the next one as well. Yeah, just all these faces mingling together in this montage of hell.
I love this one. The faces are so incredible. There's so much worry in that on the old woman in the middle.
I know.
These two people are the same. The one here and then the one in the far left corner.
Yeah, they have the same expression anyways.
Right? It's interesting.
A sense of like smug calm. Now we come to my all-time favorite drawing by Artaud. And I will read the next few slides or a description of it, so I'll read them while we look at the image. So this is the projection of the true body. The last drawing he finished around the beginning of 1948, which is also the only one from this period in which he used colored chalk, and one of the very rare ones where the sheet is used horizontally. You'll notice all the other ones were like vertical portraits. I've looked at it closely hundreds and hundreds of times without noticing it was signed at the bottom right and dated November 18th, 1946. And that is because the date and above all the signature are largely covered over, as if hidden by the colored drawing itself, and thus prior to it. This must have been originally a pencil drawing, left aside for unknown reasons, and then picked up and worked again over for several months. His prolonged cohabitation with his drawing probably has much to do with the sense of fullness that it offers. We can feel the lengthy labor he carried out day after day, and it bears the still vivid traces of the passage of his hand and the contact of his finger with the paper. There's a sort of machine on wheels on the top in the center, and this is probably the only element, along with the glossolalia and text, that was from that survived from the original drawing. And then everything else has been covered over by second inscription in black chalk. And it disappeared. The original drawing disappears under these wide, heavy strokes of colored chalk, whose predominant colors are ochre and blue. Artaud told me that he wanted to represent the projection of the true body. He himself stands on the left, with his entire body handcuffed, shackles on his feet. His knees with protruding kneecaps seem to be bound by a kind of band spitting out flames or blades. A cord leads from his bound hands through to be bound by a kind of, through the space of the drawing, around and behind a barbaric being to his right. And this being is probably his double, wearing the mask of an African sorcerer, crowned with feathers or flames, with feet like those of the king of the Incas, whose fantastical oblique body bursts forth in every direction, as if he were ejaculating spurts of flame. The cord, having wrapped itself around him, grows thicker and joins a ring that seems to encircle his thighs. From his left shoulder comes another cord that ends in a loop or a lasso and heads towards the thighs of the bound Artaud's body. Between them, an army of soldiers marches, some of whom are aiming their weapons at Artaud's immobile body. His face, modeled in black pencil and surrounded with blue chalk, is lightly silvered. The theater, he will write in 1948, is in reality the genesis of creation. And isn't this exactly what this drawing is? And shouldn't we regard it as the supreme setting for the theater of cruelty?
Beautiful. Wow. Destroy the self and be reborn anew as some kind of Incan African magi god.
The body without organs.
Yeah.
The myth. Become the myth.
Become the myth. Transcend and become deity. I love it so much. Amazing.
Right? So we'll jump ahead a few slides to the one that says to unsense the subjectile. There's two more, I think. Next one. There we go. Well, I won't dwell long on this, but I just have a few passages from it. This is an essay by Jacques Derrida. And the subjectile is a word. We saw this earlier on. It's a word that Artaud only uses ever 3 times when describing his own drawings. And Derrida extrapolates what the subjectile is. I would call this a scene, the scene of the subjectile, if there were not already a force at work to spirit away the scenic element, visibility, the element of representation, the presence of a subject and even an object. Subjectile, the word or the thing, can take the place of the subject or of the object, being neither one nor the other. 3 times at least, 3 times to my knowledge, Artaud names what is called the subjectile. He says exactly that, what is called. Indirect naming, invisible quotation marks, an allusion to the discourse of the other. He uses the word of others, but perhaps he will have it say something else. Perhaps he will tell it to do something else. So basically, yeah, I'll just keep going instead of extrapolating. The first time, on September 23rd, 1932, He concluded a letter to André Roland de Renneville with this phrase on the next slide here. Here with a bad drawing in which what is called the subjectile betrayed me. Wait a minute, a subjectile can betray. And let's be careful here. When Artaud evaluates his paintings or his drawings, when he badmouths them, i.e. a bad drawing, what it is that is bad remains to be interpreted. Already in 1932, what is being indicted is not a simple matter. It is not just a question of technique, art, or skill. The indictment is already leveled at God. He is denouncing a betrayal. And what must a subjectile do to betray? The word seems in 1932 to have been recently created. Common dictionaries had probably not yet admitted it to the spoken tongue, so the legitimacy of a subjectile remains dubious. Paul Thevenet, who has said everything needed to be known about his drawings and whose work I am presuming everyone knows, so funny, considers it necessary to clarify in a note. Perhaps it's in the part torn off of this letter that the drawing was to be found. Artaud, having considered it too revealing, must have removed it, tearing off the bottom of the page, and he indeed wrote subjectile. This note tells us at least two things. First, a drawing can be a part of a letter, which is completely different from just accompanying it. It joins with it physically, because it is only separate by dint of being the part torn off. To betray, then, and this is important, can be understood in a very particular sense. To fail in one's promise, belittle the project, remove oneself from its control, but in so doing, to reveal the truth that is thus betrayed, translating it and dragging it out into the light. Betraying the subjectile would have made the drawing too revelatory and of a truth unbearable enough for Artaud to have decided that he had to destroy its support. The latter was stronger than him, and because he had not mastered the rebellious element, Artaud would have torn it off.
Wow.
So what is a subjectile? Let us go slowly and not rush things. For Artaud is not speaking of the subjectile, only of what is called such. To take account of the calling of what is called. A subjectile is before anything, something that is called. That the subjectile is something is not yet a given. Perhaps it comes across as being someone instead, and preferably someone else, because it can betray. But the other can be here called without being a being, and above all, not a subject, not the subjectivity of a subject. Perhaps we don't know yet what is called the subjectile, because it does not constitute an object of any knowledge, and because it can betray, not come when it is called, or call itself even before being called, before receiving its name. At the very moment it is...
It's freaking deity. He's talking about deity.
Right? At the very moment it is born, Artaud's drawing situates this coup de force, a subjectile calls and sometimes betrays. And what's now next, this is important because after this was published for the 2019 edition, Derrida, before his death, came to a revelation with Paul Thevenet, which is on the next slide. Paul Thevenet has given me a text she just discovered. This would be in the early 2000s. Evidence suggests that Artaud had read it, and the word subjectile appears in it 3 times. Weird, because Artaud talks about the subjectile 3 times. It is an article that Tristan Klingsor devoted to Pierre Bonnard in 1921. He says the use of a subjectile so rarely used before, cardboard, facilitates his work. The way cardboard absorbs so easily lets him get rid of the oil colors. Moreover, Bonnard, with the seeming negligence, lets this subjectile show through here and there. Since it is rather warm and nuanced, generally golden, it contrasts with the cold tones laid down by the painter and gives them the most exquisite finesse. Once the nuances of cardboard have been discovered, the artist will use them in his canvas. He mains his orchestration in changing the subjectile. So in this book from 1921, subjectile is the medium on which an image is created.
Beautiful.
And that's
Wow.
what the common definition now is of the subjectile. But to Artaud, it is much more than this.
Right.
So about the subjectile, we would have to write what is untranslatable. To write according to the new phrasing, but discreetly, for resistance to translation when it is deliberate, noisy, spectacular. We already know it has been repatriated. In truth, its secret should only be shared with the translator.
Oh wow.
The
Crazy.
material, the unique body of the work in its first event, at its moment of birth, which cannot be repeated, which is as distinct from the form as from the meaning, the representation, here again defies translation. Unless it is taken over bodily and intact, like a foreign substance, it will never be transported into another language. So that's why I say subjectile and not maybe subjectile, which would be the anglicized version of it, because it's a word that cannot be translated.
It makes me think so much of a lot of the stuff that Ammon talks about with the mysteries and having to learn the language and going back to these, the form is present in the language itself, right? Again, this
Yeah,
idea that the medium is the message.
the medium is the message. What exceeds translation really belongs to language. Two, what so drastically exceeds linguistic transfer remains, on the contrary, foreign to language as an element of the discourse. And three, the word subjectile is itself a subjectile.
Oh, you gotta love it.
At the moment of speaking, the so-called maternal language, I remember the last stop of the subjectile, the ultimate occurrence of the word in the hand of Artaud. Father and mother are not far off. Artaud said, the figures on the inert page said nothing under my hand. They offered themselves to me like millstones, which would not inspire the drawing, and which I could probe, cut, scrape, file, sew, unsew, shred, slash, and stitch, without the subjectile ever complaining through father or through mother. We were wondering just a moment ago how subjectile, how the untranslatable can betray. What must it have become now in this return of the word 15 years later, to never complain through father or mother, at the moment when I am attacking its unresisting body with so many coups de force and in so many ways, giving myself up to it in order to operate on it, when the surgeon that I am demands to probe, cut, drape, file, sew, unsew, shred, slash, and stitch. What happened in the interval of 1932 to 1947? Something, an event, once on such and such a date. And he says, this is part of a longer passage that I'll read from this book here. It is from his passage, The Human Face. And since a certain day, in October 1939, I have not written any more without drawing as well. But what I draw are no longer subjects from art transposed from imagination to paper. They're not effective figures. They're gestures, a verb, a grammar, an arithmetic, a whole Kabbalah, and one that shits to the other, one that shits on the other. No drawing, I'm just reading from my book here.
Okay.
No drawing done on paper is a drawing, the interrogation of a straight sensibility. The drawing is a machine which has breath. It was first a machine which at the same time has breath, and it is a search for a lost world. So I would say what happened to him that would change his perspective of the subjectile. The subjectile no longer betrays him. He has mastered the subjectile, is his death.
Right. His death in the asylum, right?
He died and was reborn, literally. And that forever changed his perspective of everything. To no longer have to transpose or to translate. We'll jump to the next slide.
Okay.
The subjectile itself between two places. It has two situations. As the support of a representation, it is the subject which has become a gisant, or laid out, spread out, stretched out, inert, neutral. But it doesn't fall out like this if it is not abandoned to this downfall or this dejection. It can still be of interest for itself and not for its representation, for what it represents or the representation it bears. It is then treated otherwise, as that which participates in the forceful throwing or casting but also as what has to be traversed, pierced, penetrated in order to have done with the screen. That is the inert support of representation. So
Wow.
not only is it the idea, it's not just the idea, it is not just the expression of the idea, it is not just the medium on which the idea is expressed. It is all of these things, and yet it is none of them.
Right? It is the ideal. It's deity. It's
It is
spirit.
the it is the other. He
Yeah.
described it as the other.
Amazing. The other. Wow.
After having it traversed, passing through to the other side, after having exploded the wall of the problem, as he says in his work Fiends and Tortures. I hasten to quote these words in this work so as to insist that we will never hear anything about the subjectile without having the fiend and the torture resound in it, and without reading the pages that bear this title. The
Wow.
subjectile resists. It has to resist. Sometimes it resists too much, sometimes not enough. It must resist in order to be treated finally as itself, and not as the support or the fiend of something else, the surface or the subservient substratum of a representation. This latter has to be traversed in the direction of the subjectile. But inversely, the subjectile, a screen or support for representation, must be traversed by the projectile. We have to pass beneath the one that is already beneath. Its inert body must not resist too much. If it does, it has to be mistreated and violently attacked. We will come to blows with it. Then neither nor of the subjectile, neither subservient nor dominating, situates the place of a double constraint, and this way becomes unrepresentable. It is
Wow.
neither object nor subject, neither screen nor projectile, but the subjectile can become all of that, stabilizing itself in a certain form or moving about in another. But the drama of its own becoming always oscillates between the intrusivity of Gesser and the transivity of Gesser, in what I will call the conjecture of both. I think Gesser is like laying down.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm stretched. In the first case, I'm stretched out, lying down in my bed, brought down, brought low, without life. I am where I have been thrown. This is the situation of the subject or the subjectile. They're thrown beneath. In the second case, I throw something, a projectile, stones, a firebrand, seed ejaculated, or dice. At the same time, and because I've thrown something, I can have lifted it or founded it. I lay down foundations. I institute by throwing out something. The subjectile does not throw out anything, but it has been laid down and even founded. A foundation in its turn can thus found, sustain a construction, and serve as a support.
This is such deep magic here because when you're talking about those foundations, right? This is what the muses do. What does the muse do? It teaches you how to build that foundation. It gives you that foundational ideal that allows you to generate and move through the cycles of death and rebirth. And that's what the subjectile is. It's that foundation, right?
And it is not just the foundation, it is the entire act of creation itself.
Right.
It's the muse giving the message to the artist, the message, the artist interpreting the message, the artist creating the message, and then the medium on which the message is presented. All of this is the subjectile alternated, oscillates between these states of being in a grand theatrical, magical performance.
Beautiful.
We'll skip this last slide and look at some more drawings. So this is from his notebook in December 1947. These are his he filled 46, I believe, of these notebooks from 1945 to 1948.
Wow.
Over 20,000 pages of writing and drawing.
That's incredible.
In like a 2.5 year span. It's wild. Next, we have another drawing from one of these notebooks. Just strange. Hard to say what it really is. Very magical, though, as always. And lastly, we will conclude with one more spell. It's double-sided. I have both sides shown in the slides. The next one is the back. And I will read the translation. All those who have conferred with each other to prevent me from taking heroin, All those who have harmed Anne Manson because of that, on Sunday, May 21st, 1939, I will have them pierced alive on a Paris square, and I will have them perforated and their marrow burned. I am in a mental asylum, but this madman's dream will be realized, and it will be realized by me.
Wow, that's crazy.
I thought that'd be a nice way to conclude this discussion with another of these powerful spells.
I just love too. We can make out heroin. La
Yeah,
heroin. Wow.
Leroin. Yeah, just wild. And so, what I want people to take away from all this, again, which we've uttered, we've kind of nailed on the head a few times already, which is that these drawings and portraits to Artaud transcend drawing and art. They are magical operations. They are an attempt to reveal the myth.
Yeah. And reveal the processes, right? He was really trying to show people how to transform their life and how to go through this process of death and rebirth and self-discovery. And he did that in his own life in his own way. And, everything he did was for this, to show people this kind of meaning and this ability to become deified in a sense, to transcend through your art, to transcend self and to transcend meaning and to leave something memorable, right?
Exactly.
Why Artaud is a dragon.
As he says in the theater, in the postscriptum to Theater of Cruelty, I am Antonin Artaud, and as I say this, and I know how to say this, immediately my body will burst into 1,000, and burst and reassemble into 1,000 different fragments from which you will never be able to forget me.
And I set myself ablaze like the bright virago to ascend to the stars. Wow.
And to persist in matter in all these multiple forms of creation that he's left behind.
Beautiful. Wow. Yeah, Artaud is quite the artist, right? And we can recognize that the medium of creation, really, and in how all aspects of his art appear in his drawings, right? You see the theatrical elements, you see the written, you see everything. He tried to do as much as he could, right? He even burns and manipulates the paper. So everything is a choice with Artaud. Everything is thought out and has intention, and meaning. So much of everything he did was about applying meaning to everything,
Definitely. He was not quite an existentialist, not quite an absurdist, just he had this idea of theatricalizing your own life, returning to the spectacle, the spontaneity of life, and embracing its mythical powers.
Becoming the fool, embodying Dionysus, creating and setting yourself ablaze to ascend to the stars. A magician in the truest sense of the word. Amazing.
Exactly.
So, Graham, now that we're done, do you have anything coming up that you want to recommend to our audience, or anything you'd like to talk about? You did mention some new music to me earlier.
Yeah, so on Thursday, I recorded and released 2 short songs on my Bandcamp, grahamquinn.bandcamp.com, and it's called The Scraping, and it's 2 short tracks that flow into each other, and I had a lot of fun making them, so I put them up for free, and you can listen to them, you can download them, and enjoy them, hopefully.
And you also have you've decided now to release your graphic novel on your own, and you're currently working on getting that released. What's the timeline for your graphic novel?
Yeah, so I decided ultimately to go against working with Syrup Moose for a variety of reasons. I respect him and his work, but I decided I've been alone for so long that I want to continue forging my own path. And I'm in the process of redrawing 1 or 2 scenes, and then I have to transfer it all digitally. But my ultimate release date is January 2025 now.
Amazing. So everyone, make sure. Go ahead, sir.
I'm saying that is the set date. You can pre-order it now. It's going to be ready. and it's up on my site.
Yeah, so everyone go check out the description. You'll find Graham's link tree where you can find links to his Bandcamp as well as to his publication house, thingsinmychest.com. And you can pre-order his graphic novel, and you can even get the accompanying audio that he made. He released an album to accompany it as well.
Yes.
And if you want to see a preview for the graphic novel, a few months back, Graham and I did a deep dive into it, which was a lot of fun.
It was a
So
blast.
amazing stuff. And next week, we're going to come back and we're going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite poets, Hilda Doolittle, HD, a true magician, absolutely. And we're going to look at one of her more interesting works, something that doesn't get a lot talked about. She's mostly seen as one of these imagist poets, and a lot of is made of her earlier career or the stuff that she wrote with her lover and partner Breyer during World War II. You know, these were sort of the times when people were really looking at her. But I find that her most magical and truly radical stuff came near the end of her life. In her twilight years, she wrote this incredible book called Hermetic Definition, where she really explores magic and myth making and her own spiritual philosophy that's seen through the lens of Hellenism, paganism and witchcraft, queer theory, as well as psychoanalysis. She was a friend and close colleague of Freud and actually received psychoanalysis from Freud. So she's an incredible person, and I can't wait to dive into Hermetic Definition with you all. You guys are going to love it.
That's going to be amazing. I can't wait.
And then, Graham, you have a new person you want to talk about. What are you going to do for your next episode?
Oh, the Bataille?
Yeah. You were.
Or what were you thinking? What were you thinking? I have a few ideas in mind.
I know you had mentioned Bataille, and you had also mentioned potentially the
Alfred Jarry or
Jarry.
Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
Yeah, Muti Watiango was the one that sounded wild to me. Or Bataille.
That's the one I'd like to work on next.
Yeah, so talk about this one because we need to do this.
So I don't know if I apologize if I'm butchering his name, but Ngugi wa Thiong'o is an author who was from Kenya, I believe, and was exiled for writings about the government. And he has this amazing magical text that I discovered by pure chance called The Wizard of the Crow. And it is considered his magnum opus. And it is, as he calls it, an attempt to explain the last 200 years of African history.
So you know it's going to be wild, magical, and absolutely brutal and just revealing to all of us who are not familiar with a lot of that history, right? We're so removed and that culture has been so hidden from us. So this is going to be something so beautiful. I'm really excited for this one.
It's going to take me a while to have it ready, but it's a long text. It's like 700 pages. So I need to find a way to summarize it and just find a few select beautiful passages that will, shed some light on the work.
But we're going to have some fun, some big stuff coming in. What was that text called? Wizard of the Crow?
Wizard of the Crow.
Wizard of the Crow. So look forward to Wizard of the Crow and Hermetic Definition. Any last words and any last comments on Artaud and drawings and portraits before we leave our audience tonight?
There's a great saying that's become a meme that I love that sums up Artaud and sums up how I feel about life. The horrors persist, but so do I.
Right? The horrors persist, but so do I. I love it. Makes me think of Dionysus, right? Embrace that fool, take the leap, laugh in the face of absurdity, remake the universe in your own imagination. All right, everyone. Peace and love. Take care. Make sure you follow Graham and tune in next week for more Searching for Dragons. Till next time. All right, here we go. Oops.
master could be, and I pressed my eye eagerly to the grave. And I wondered who his master could be, and I pressed my eye eagerly to the grave. And I wondered who his master could be, and I pressed my eye eagerly to the grave. And I wondered who his master could be, and I pressed my eye eagerly to the grave. And I wondered who his master could be, and I pressed my eye eagerly to the grave. And I wondered who his master could be, and I pressed